December 2nd, 1804, 11:47 a.m., Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris. The crown sat on red velvet. Napoleon didn't wait for the Pope to place it. He reached forward, lifted it himself, and set it upon his own head. History would remember this moment not as coronation, but as declaration. Before the cannon fire, before the frozen corpses at Eylau, before the burning of Moscow and the blood-soaked fields of Waterloo, there was only a man, Napoleon Bonaparte, born on a small island called Corsica in 1769, the son of minor nobility with more pride than wealth. He spoke French with an accent. He was short by the standards of myth, average by the standards of reality. His hands were small, his eyes pale, cold, unblinking, burned with something deeper than ambition. It was hunger, not for food, not even for power in the way kings wanted it. Inherited, divine, assured. Napoleon's hunger was different. It was the need to prove that a man could rise beyond birth, beyond circumstance, beyond the suffocating weight of history itself. By 1803, he had already done the impossible. At 26, he had commanded the army of Italy and shattered the Austrians. At 30, he had crossed the Alps, crushed coalitions, and forced Europe to its knees. At 35, he had crowned himself emperor, not of France alone, but of an idea. That idea was simple. One man, one vision, one Europe. But Europe was not interested in unity. Europe was a chessboard of old dynasties, nervous kings, and empires who despised the notion that a Corsican artillery officer could dictate their fate. Britain watched from across the channel, arms folded, treasury open. Russia loomed in the east, vast and patient, her winters colder than diplomacy. Austria seethed in silence, nursing old wounds and preparing new armies. Prussia drilled its soldiers. In the shadow of Frederick the Great, convinced of its own invincibility, Spain sat divided, caught between loyalty and survival. And Napoleon stood in the center, holding a map of Europe like it was his personal canvas. He had redrawn Italy, reorganized Germany, humiliated Austria, crowned himself king of Italy, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire with a stroke of a pen, an empire that had lasted 1,000 years. He moved borders the way other men moved furniture. But ambition, unchecked, becomes its own enemy. And Napoleon's ambition had no ceiling. It was limitless, relentless, devouring. It fed on victory and grew hungrier with every conquest. In Paris, the court glittered. Soldiers stood at attention in new uniforms stitched with gold thread. Marshals, men who had been sergeants and captains just years before, now commanded armies larger than kingdoms. They wore titles like Duke of Dalmatia and Prince of Pontecorvo. They built palaces. They married into old blood. But in the quiet moments when the music stopped and the candles dimmed, they knew the truth. This empire was held together not by law or tradition, but by one man's will. And will, no matter how strong, is still mortal. The first cracks appeared in 1803. The Treaty of Amiens, a fragile peace between France and Britain, shattered like glass. Britain refused to evacuate Malta. Napoleon refused to compromise. Diplomats left. Fleets mobilized. War returned, not with a roar, but with the quiet certainty of tide. Britain was untouchable by land. Her navy ruled the waves, patrolling, blockading, choking French trade. Napoleon paced the cliffs of Boulogne, staring across the channel at the white cliffs of Dover, so close he could almost taste them. He gathered 200,000 men, the Grande Armée, the finest fighting force Europe had ever seen. They drilled, they waited. Flat-bottomed boats lined the shore, ready to carry them across 21 miles of water. All Napoleon needed was 5 hours of naval superiority. 5 hours, just long enough to land, to march, to break the British before they could organize. But the Royal Navy was not careless. Admiral Horatio Nelson commanded the Mediterranean fleet with the precision of a surgeon and the aggression of a predator. He blockaded French ports, hunted their fleets, and refused to give Napoleon even 5 minutes, let alone 5 hours. And so the invasion never came. The soldiers at Boulogne packed their tents, slung their muskets, and turned east. Because while Napoleon had been staring at Britain, Austria and Russia had been forming a new coalition, the Third Coalition, and this time they would not negotiate. August 1805, Boulogne, France. Napoleon stood in his tent, maps covering every surface. Candlelight flickered across lines and names: Vienna, Ulm, the Danube, the Rhine. His mind moved faster than his staff could follow. "We have two choices," he said, voice calm, surgical. "We wait for the Austrians and Russians to unite their armies and crush us with numbers, or we move now, split them, and destroy them separately." Marshal Berthier, his chief of staff, nodded. Berthier was not a battlefield general. He was something rarer. He was the man who could translate Napoleon's genius into orders, logistics, supply lines. He turned vision into reality. "The Austrians are moving west. Berthier said, tracing a line on the map. General Mack commands their main army. He expects us to attack through the Black Forest. Napoleon smiled. It was not a warm smile. Then we will not attack through the Black Forest. The plan was audacious. Instead of marching directly toward the Austrian army, Napoleon would swing north, cross the Rhine, and arc around behind them. He would cut their supply lines, trap them against the Danube, and force them to surrender without a single major battle. It required speed, precision, deception, and the Grande Armée was built for all three. On August 27, 1805, the army began to move, not in a column but in corps, self-contained units of 20,000 to 30,000 men, each capable of fighting independently, each commanded by a marshal loyal to Napoleon. They marched on parallel roads, spread across a front 200 miles wide, converging only when necessary. It was revolutionary. Traditional armies moved in one massive column, slow, predictable, vulnerable. Napoleon's army moved like a living organism, fast and flexible, capable of concentrating overwhelming force at a single point within hours. The soldiers sang as they marched, veterans of Italy, Egypt, the Rhine, young conscripts with muskets taller than they were. They wore blue coats and tall shakos. They carried 60 pounds of equipment. They marched 20 miles a day, sometimes 30. They called themselves the Immortals, not because they couldn't die, and they died by the thousands, but because the Grande Armée itself seemed unkillable. No matter how many fell, it kept coming. September 1805, Ulm, Bavaria, General Karl Mack von Leiberich commanded the Austrian army. He was competent, experienced, confident. He had 72,000 men under his command, well-trained, well-supplied, dug in around the fortress city of Ulm. He expected Napoleon to come from the west. Napoleon came from the north. By the time Mack realized what was happening, French corps were already crossing the Danube behind him, cutting the roads to Vienna. Marshal Ney drove into his flank. Marshal Soult blocked his escape. Marshal Lannes circled like a wolf. Mack was surrounded. He sent messengers to the Russian army begging them to hurry, but the Russians were still 200 miles away, marching slowly through hostile terrain, unsure if they were walking into a trap. On October 15th, Mack tried to break out. His columns advanced into French musket fire, cannon fire, cavalry charges. They broke, they retreated, they tried again. It was hopeless. On October 20th, 1805, General Mack surrendered. 7,000 Austrian soldiers laid down their arms. Another 10,000 had been killed or captured in the fighting. The rest had deserted. Napoleon had destroyed an entire army without fighting a single major battle, but he didn't celebrate. He knew the real war was just beginning, because the Russians were coming. November 1805, Moravia. The Russian army arrived too late to save Mack, but they were not defeated. Not yet. Commanded by General Mikhail Kutuzov, old, cautious, cunning, they withdrew east, refusing to engage. Kutuzov knew Napoleon's strength. He also knew Russia's greatest weapon was not soldiers or strategy. It was space. Draw Napoleon deeper. Stretch his supply lines. Let winter and distance do what armies could not. But Tsar Alexander I, young and proud, wanted victory. He wanted glory. He wanted to prove that Russia could stand toe-to-toe with the great Napoleon and win. He overruled Kutuzov. On December 2nd, 1805, the combined Russian and Austrian armies, 85,000 men, took position on the Pratzen Heights near a small Moravian village. The village was called Austerlitz, and Napoleon had been waiting for them. December the 2nd, 1805, 06:30 a.m., Austerlitz, Moravia. Fog rolled across the frozen fields like a living thing, thick and cold, swallowing sound and sight. 73,000 French soldiers stood in silence, breath misting in the pre-dawn air. They could hear the enemy, boots crunching on frost, horses snorting, the distant clatter of artillery wheels, but they could not see them. Not yet. Napoleon had slept 4 hours. He woke before dawn, dressed, and rode along the line. Soldiers lit torches as he passed, thousands of them, a river of fire moving through the mist. They cheered, not loudly, not wildly, just a low, steady roar that said one thing: we trust you. He reached the command post on the Zuran Hill, dismounted and studied the field. The Pratzen Heights rose in the center, high ground, the key to the battlefield. The Allies held it, for now. Napoleon's plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. He had deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look vulnerable, inviting the Allies to attack. If they took the bait, they would descend from the Pratzen Heights, leaving it exposed. Then Napoleon would strike the center with overwhelming force, split the Allied army in half, and destroy them piecemeal. Everything depended on timing. If the Allies attacked too early, before Marshal Davout's corps arrived to reinforce the right, the flank would collapse. If they didn't attack at all, Napoleon would be forced into a frontal assault against superior numbers on high ground. But Napoleon had studied his enemies. He knew Alexander was young, eager, overconfident. He knew the Austrian generals despised Kutuzov's caution. He knew they would attack. He just had to survive long enough for them to make the mistake. 7 a.m. The fog began to thin. On the Pratzen Heights, Allied officers peered down through the mist. They saw the French right flank, thin, weak, barely holding. They saw the opportunity. Tsar Alexander gave the order. Attack. 85,000 men began to move. Russian columns descended from the heights, boots hammering frozen ground. Austrian cavalry formed ranks. Artillery unlimbered. Crews loading solid shot and canister. Drummers beat the cadence. Officers shouted commands in 3 languages, Russian, German, French. They marched toward the French right flank like a tidal wave. 7:30 a.m. The right flank. Marshal Davout's the 3rd Corps had marched 70 miles in 48 hours. The soldiers were exhausted, freezing, half-starved, but they were there, and now they stood in the way of 40,000 enemy soldiers. Davout rode along the line, calm, methodical. He did not shout. He did not need to. His men called him the Iron Marshal, not because he was cruel, but because he was unbreakable. Hold, he said quietly. Just hold. The Russian columns came on. 200 yards, 150, 100. French artillery opened fire. Cannonballs ripped through the advancing ranks, tearing men apart, splintering bones, turning formations into chaos. But the Russians didn't stop. They closed ranks and kept coming. At 50 yards, the French infantry fired. Musket balls slammed into flesh, dropping soldiers mid-stride. Smoke rolled across the field, thick and acrid. Officers screamed orders no one could hear. Soldiers reloaded by instinct. Bite cartridge, pour powder, ram ball, aim, fire. Again, again, again. The Russians reached the French line. Bayonets clashed. Men grappled in the mud, stabbing, gouging, screaming. Drummers kept beating even as they fell. Flags waved through the smoke, bloodied and torn but still standing. Davout's line bent, but it did not break. A.M. The Pratzen Heights. Napoleon watched the Russian attack develop, watched them commit more and more troops to the right flank. Watched the Pratzen Heights, the key to the entire battlefield, slowly empty. He turned to Marshal Soult. How long until you can take the heights? Soult smiled. 20 minutes, sire, maybe less. Then go. Soult's IV Corps, 24,000 men, surged forward. They climbed through the thinning mist, moving fast, moving silent. The Allied troops still on the heights were reserves, rearguard units not expecting an attack. By the time they realized what was happening, French infantry was already among them. Musket fire erupted at point-blank range. Russian artillery crews tried to turn their guns, but French infantry bayoneted them before they could load. Officers drew sabers and fought hand-to-hand, but they were overwhelmed, outnumbered, outflanked. Within an hour, the Pratzen Heights belonged to Napoleon. 9:45 a.m. The Allied commanders realized too late what had happened. Their army was cut in half. The northern wing, under the Russian Imperial Guard, was intact but isolated. The southern wing, the bulk of their force, was trapped between Davout's corps on the right and Soult's corps on the heights. They tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. 10:15 a.m. The Pratzen Heights. Marshal Bernadotte's Third Corps moved into position on the captured heights. Artillery crews unlimbered their guns, sighted, and began firing into the trapped Allied formations below. Solid shots smashed into cavalry columns. Canister turned infantry into meat. Shells exploded above marching troops, spraying shrapnel like rain. The southern wing of the Allied army began to disintegrate. Units broke formation. Officers lost control. Soldiers threw down their muskets and ran. The French pursued not with cruelty but with clinical efficiency. Cavalry rode down fleeing infantry. Cannons fired into clustered formations. There was no escape. Thousands of Russian and Austrian soldiers were driven onto the frozen ponds south of Austerlitz. The ice cracked. Men plunged into freezing water, weighted down by equipment, uniforms, weapons. They thrashed. They screamed. They drowned. French artillery fired into the ice, shattering it further, turning the ponds into mass graves. The northern sector, but the battle was not over. The Russian Imperial Guard, the elite, the best trained, best equipped soldiers in the Tsar's army, had not yet entered the fight. They stood in reserve, 10,000 men, waiting for orders. Tsar Alexander, desperate, threw them forward. They advanced in perfect formation, colors flying, drums beating, every button polished, every musket gleaming. These were not conscripts. These were professionals, veterans, men who had trained their entire lives for moments like this. They crashed into the French center like a hammer. The French line buckled. Units fell back. Marshal Lannes, commanding the V Corps, rode into the chaos, rallying his men, cursing, screaming, daring the Russians to come closer. "Stand! God damn you, stand!" His men obeyed. The fighting became savage. Point-blank musket volleys, bayonet charges, artillery firing canister at ranges so close the gun crews could see the faces of the men they killed. For 15 minutes, it looked like the Imperial Guard might break through. Then Napoleon released the Garde Impériale, his own Imperial Guard. They marched forward in silence. No shouting, no drums, just the steady tramp of boots and the rattle of equipment. These were Napoleon's finest, veterans of every campaign, hand-picked, fanatically loyal, feared across Europe. They didn't charge. They advanced methodically, remorselessly. The Russian Guard fought hard, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and exhausted. Slowly, Step by step, they were pushed back. By noon, they were in retreat. 30 p.m. The battle was over. The Allied army, 85,000 strong just 6 hours ago, was shattered. 15,000 dead, 12,000 wounded, 11,000 captured. The rest were scattered, fleeing east in broken columns, abandoning artillery, supplies, standards. Napoleon had lost 9,000 men. Painful, but acceptable. He stood on the Pratzen Heights, watching the remnants of the Allied army disappear into the distance. Smoke drifted across the field, mixing with the fog. Bodies lay in rows. Horses screamed in agony. Wounded men called for water, for help, for mercy. Marshal Soult approached, exhausted, bloodied, victorious. "Sire, the enemy is destroyed." Napoleon nodded slowly. "One battle is not a war, Soult, but it is a beginning." He was wrong. Austerlitz was not a beginning. It was the peak. Everything that followed, every victory, every conquest, every crown, would be an attempt to recapture this moment, and everything that followed would also bring him closer to the end. December 3rd, 1805. Austerlitz. Tsar Alexander requested a ceasefire. Francis II of Austria sued for peace. Within weeks, Austria would sign the Treaty of Pressburg, surrendering vast territories, paying massive indemnities, and withdrawing from the coalition. Prussia, watching from the sidelines, remained neutral. For now, Russia retreated east, licking her wounds but unbroken, and Britain remained untouched. Untouchable, waiting across the channel, her treasury open, her navy supreme. But for Napoleon, Austerlitz was his masterpiece, his greatest victory. The moment when Europe trembled at his name, he would never surpass it. 1807, the Prussian campaign. Prussia made a mistake, emboldened by pride, humiliated by French dominance, convinced of their own military superiority. They declared war in September 1806. It lasted 6 weeks. Napoleon moved with terrifying speed. The Grande Armée smashed through Prussian defenses at Jena and Auerstedt on the same day, October 14, 1806, destroying both wings of the Prussian army simultaneously. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt was not close. It was annihilation. Marshal Davout, outnumbered 2-1 at Auerstedt, shattered the main Prussian army through sheer discipline and tactical brilliance. Napoleon, at Jena, crushed the secondary force with overwhelming firepower. Within days, Berlin fell. The Prussian king fled. The army dissolved. Napoleon stood in Frederick the Great's palace and took the great king's sword as a trophy. Prussia, the proud, militaristic state that had dominated Central Europe for a century, ceased to exist as an independent power, but Russia was still in the war. February 8, 1807, 08 a.m. Eylau, Poland. Snow fell like ash. The wind howled. The temperature dropped below freezing, and 140,000 men prepared to kill each other in a frozen wasteland. Eylau was not a battle Napoleon wanted. It was a battle forced upon him by circumstance, by winter, by an enemy that refused to break. The Russian army, commanded by General Levin von Bennigsen, occupied the town of Eylau. Napoleon attacked. What followed was not strategy or brilliance. It was butchery. French infantry advanced into Russian artillery fire. Cannons loaded with canister, metal balls packed into canisters, turned entire companies into red mist. Soldiers marched through blizzards so thick they couldn't see 10 feet ahead. They stumbled over frozen corpses. They fought with frost-numbed hands. At one point, Marshal Augereau's 7th Corps marched directly into Russian guns in zero visibility. 14,000 men. Half of them died within minutes. Napoleon's center collapsed. Russian cavalry charged, smashing into French formations, killing, trampling, scattering. For a moment, it looked like Napoleon himself might be captured. Then Marshal Murat, the greatest cavalry commander in Europe, led 11,000 horsemen in the largest cavalry charge in history. They struck the Russian center like a thunderbolt. For 20 minutes, the battlefield became chaos, sabers flashing, horses screaming, men hacking, slashing, dying. The charge didn't break the Russian army, but it bought Napoleon time. Time for reinforcements to arrive. Time to stabilize the line. Time to survive. By nightfall, both armies were spent. 25,000 French casualties, 15,000 Russian casualties. Neither side could continue. The Russians withdrew during the night. Technically, Napoleon won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. June 14th, 1807, Friedland, Poland. 4 months later, Napoleon got his revenge. At Friedland, he caught the Russian army with their backs to a river. He pinned them, then crushed them with massed artillery and infantry assaults. The Russians tried to retreat across the river. The bridges collapsed under the weight. Thousands drowned. It was Austerlitz all over again. Overwhelming, decisive. Brutal Tsar Alexander sued for peace. On June 25th, 1807, Napoleon and Alexander met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. They negotiated. They drank. They became allies. The Treaty of Tilsit followed. Russia withdrew from the war. Prussia was reduced to a rump state. Napoleon was master of Europe, from Spain to Poland, from the North Sea to the Adriatic. His empire stretched across the continent. Kings bowed, dynasties trembled. His brothers wore crowns. He had done it. He had redrawn Europe. But ambition, once fed, only grows hungrier. Spain. Napoleon made his first fatal mistake. He invaded Spain, not because Spain threatened him, but because Spain was weak, divided, and strategically valuable. He deposed the Spanish king, installed his brother Joseph on the throne, and expected compliance. He got guerrilla warfare. Spanish civilians, farmers, shepherds, priests took up arms. They ambushed French patrols. They burned supply depots. They murdered collaborators in the night. The French called it La Petite Guerre, the Little War. It bled France dry. $100,000 French soldiers would fight in Spain over the next 6 years. 200,000 would never come home. They died in ambushes and sieges in the mountains. They died of disease, starvation, exhaustion. And while Napoleon was distracted in Spain, Austria rearmed. In 09, Austria strikes back. In April 1809, Austria launched a surprise offensive, hoping to catch Napoleon off guard. They invaded Bavaria, rallied German states, and advanced with 300,000 men. Napoleon rushed back from Spain. He was outnumbered, outpositioned, and caught by surprise. But he was still Napoleon. At Eckmühl, he shattered the Austrian army with a flanking maneuver. At Aspern-Essling, he suffered his first major defeat, 20,000 casualties, forced to retreat across the Danube under fire. But at Wagram, in July 1809, he won the campaign. It was not elegant, not brilliant, just grinding, bloody, exhausting. 2 days of fighting. 70,000 casualties on both sides. The Austrians broke first. Austria signed the Treaty of Schönbrunn. More territory lost, more reparations paid, more humiliation swallowed. But Napoleon had won by attrition, not genius. The battles were harder, the victories narrower, the costs higher, and the cracks in his empire were widening. Aim 12. Russia, Napoleon's greatest mistake. In June 1812, he invaded Russia with 600,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in European history. His goal was simple: force Russia to rejoin the continental system, the trade blockade against Britain. Tsar Alexander had been ignoring it. Napoleon decided to remind him who was in charge. The Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River and marched east. The Russians retreated and retreated and retreated. They burned their own towns, poisoned their own wells, destroyed their own crops. Napoleon advanced through a wasteland, chasing an enemy that refused to fight. On September 7, 1812, the Russians finally made a stand at Borodino. September 7, 1812, 06 a.m. Borodino, Russia. The sun rose over a field that would become a graveyard. 1,000 French soldiers faced 120,000 Russians. The Russians had built earthwork fortifications, redoubts, trenches, artillery emplacements. They waited in silence. Napoleon attacked. For 12 hours the battle raged. French infantry stormed the redoubts again and again. Russian artillery fired point-blank into advancing columns. Cavalry charged. Infantry countercharged. Men fought in smoke so thick they couldn't see 5 feet. At one point, Marshal Ney captured a redoubt, lost it, captured it again, lost it again. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand over the same patch of ground 4 times. By evening, the Russians withdrew. Technically, Napoleon won, but 30,000 French soldiers were dead or wounded, 45,000 Russians, and the Russian army was still intact. September 14, 1812, Moscow. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting surrender. He found an empty city. The population had fled. The government had evacuated, and that night fires broke out across the city. Deliberate, systematic. The Russians were burning their own capital. Napoleon waited for 5 weeks, expecting Tsar Alexander to negotiate. Alexander never replied. On October 19th, with winter approaching and supplies dwindling, Napoleon gave the order: retreat. October-December 1812, the retreat from Moscow. The retreat became a nightmare. Winter came early. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees Celsius. Snow fell without end. The Grande Armée, 600,000 men strong just months ago, began to disintegrate. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep. Horses collapsed and were butchered for meat. Supply wagons were abandoned. Discipline evaporated. Men deserted. Officers shot themselves. Russian Cossacks harassed the retreat, picking off stragglers, burning supplies, cutting off escape routes. French soldiers fought back with frozen fingers, firing muskets that barely worked in the cold. At the Berezina River, the French tried to cross on makeshift bridges. The bridges collapsed under the weight. Thousands drowned or were crushed in the panic. Russian artillery fired into the chaos. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée crossed back into Poland, fewer than 100,000 soldiers remained. 100,000 men had died, not in battle, but from cold, hunger, disease, and despair. Napoleon abandoned the army and raced back to Paris in a sleigh. He needed to secure his throne before the vultures descended, because Europe smelled blood. 1813, the War of the Sixth. Coalition Prussia, Austria, Russia, Sweden, Britain. They all turned on Napoleon at once. He fought back with skill and desperation, winning battles at Lutzen, Bautzen, and Dresden. But he couldn't win the war. His army was made up of teenage conscripts now, not veterans. His marshals were exhausted. His resources were dwindling. On October 16th or 19th, 1813, the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, became the largest battle in European history before the 20th century. 100,000 soldiers. 3 days of fighting. 100,000 casualties. Napoleon lost. He retreated into France. The Allies followed. In 14, the fall. In March 1814, Paris fell to Allied forces. Napoleon's marshals refused to fight anymore. His empire collapsed. His allies deserted. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. He was exiled to the island of Elba, a tiny speck of land off the coast of Italy. He was given a pension, a small guard, and a title, Emperor of Elba. It was humiliating, but Napoleon was not. Finished March 1st, 1815. The return. Napoleon escaped Elba with 1,000 men and landed in southern France. The French government sent an army to arrest him. When the soldiers saw Napoleon, they didn't fire. They cheered. Regiment after regiment defected. Marshal Ney, who had sworn to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, embraced him and rejoined his service. Within 3 weeks, Napoleon was back in Paris. King Louis XVI fled. The empire was restored. Europe was horrified. The Allies declared Napoleon an outlaw and mobilized their armies. 700,000 soldiers converged on France. Napoleon had $125,000. He decided to strike first, fast, before the Allies could unite. He marched into Belgium, targeting the British and Prussian armies separately. On June 16th, he defeated the Prussians at Ligny. On June 18th, he met the British at a small crossroads called Waterloo. June 18th, 1815, 11:30 a.m. Waterloo, Belgium. Rain had turned the ground to mud. Artillery wheels sank. Horses struggled. Soldiers stood in formation, soaked, shivering, waiting. The Duke of Wellington commanded the British and Allied army, 68,000 men, on a low ridge south of Waterloo. Napoleon commanded $72,000. It should have been a French victory, but the mud delayed Napoleon's attack. And Wellington was not Mack or Bennigsen. He was patient, methodical, unshakable. Napoleon attacked the center. Wellington's line held. Napoleon sent cavalry, massed charges of thousands of horsemen, crashing into British infantry squares. The squares held. Napoleon committed the Imperial Guard, his finest troops undefeated in 20 years of war. They marched up the ridge through smoke and fire, bayonets fixed. Wellington's infantry rose from the reverse slope and fired. The Imperial Guard broke. For the first time in their history, they retreated, and then the Prussians arrived. Marshal Blucher's army, 50,000 men, battered but unbroken from Ligny, smashed into Napoleon's right flank. The French army collapsed. Soldiers threw down their muskets and ran. Officers abandoned their commands. The Imperial Guard formed square around Napoleon, fighting to the last, buying time for him to escape. He rode from the field in darkness, defeated. Finished. June 22nd, 1815. Paris. Napoleon abdicated for the second time. This time, the Allies were not merciful. He was exiled to St. Helena, a barren island in the South Atlantic, 200 miles from the nearest land. He would never leave. May 5th, 1821. St. Helena. Napoleon Bonaparte died at age 51. Stomach cancer, most likely, though some suspected poison. He spent his final years dictating memoirs, arguing with his captors, and staring at the ocean. In his last moments, he whispered, "France, army, head of the army." His body was brought back to Paris in 1840 and interred in Les Invalides beneath a massive dome in a tomb of red stone. Millions visit it every year. They stand in silence, looking down at the man who tried to redraw Europe. Epilogue: the Napoleonic Wars killed 3 to 6 million people. They reshaped borders, destroyed empires, and birthed nationalism across Europe. Napoleon's legal code, the Code Napoleon, still influences law in dozens of countries. His military tactics are still studied in war colleges. His ambition is still debated by historians. Was he a tyrant? A liberator? A genius? A monster? Perhaps he was all of these things. Or perhaps he was simply a man who refused to accept that some things cannot be conquered. Not by brilliance, not by will, not by force. Russia could not be conquered. Winter could not be defeated. And Europe, in the end, would not bow. 15 to 1821. St. Helena. The island was a prison disguised as exile. St. Helena sat in the middle of the South Atlantic like a forgotten rock. No trees, no harbor. Just cliffs, wind, and the endless sound of waves. The British garrison watched Napoleon constantly. His movements were restricted. His letters were censored. His visitors were monitored. He lived in Longwood House, a damp, moldy building that leaked when it rained. The walls were thin. The rooms were small. The man who had ruled from palaces now spent his days in what amounted to a comfortable cage. But Napoleon did not waste his time. He wrote. Every day, he dictated his memoirs to the small staff of loyal followers who had chosen exile with him. General Bertrand, General Gourgaud, Emmanuel Las Casas. They recorded his words, his memories, his justifications. Napoleon rewrote his own history. He portrayed himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. fighter, not as a tyrant but as a reformer. He claimed he had wanted only to unite Europe, to spread enlightenment, to bring the ideals of the revolution to the oppressed peoples of the continent. Some of it was true, some of it was myth. All of it was calculated, because Napoleon understood something his enemies did not. He had lost the war, but he could still win the narrative, and he did. Within a generation, Napoleon was no longer just a military leader. He was a symbol, a legend, the embodiment of ambition, genius, and tragic downfall. Romantic poets wrote about him. Artists painted him. Soldiers toasted him in secret. He became larger in death than he had been in life. The cost of genius. But while Napoleon built his legend on St. Helena, Europe counted the bodies to 6 million dead. The exact number will never be known. Soldiers killed in battle. Civilians starved by sieges. Villages burned. Cities sacked. Entire generations lost. France alone lost 1.4 million men. Russia lost over 1 million. Prussia, Austria, Spain, all bled white by years of constant warfare. The Grande Armée, once 600,000 strong, was scattered across Europe in unmarked graves. At Borodino, at Leipzig, in the frozen wastes of Russia. At Waterloo, Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, was executed by firing squad in Paris after Waterloo. He had served Napoleon loyally for 20 years. He died in front of the Luxembourg Gardens, refusing a blindfold, giving the order to fire himself. Soldiers, straight to the heart. Marshal Murat, the cavalry genius, was captured in Italy trying to reclaim his throne as King of Naples. He was executed by firing squad in 1815. He faced the guns in full dress uniform, his medals gleaming. Aim for the heart. Spare the face. Marshal Lannes had died in 1809 at Aspern-Essling, legs shattered by a cannonball. Napoleon had wept at his bedside. Marshal Bessières died in 1813, killed by a cannonball during a reconnaissance mission. Marshal Duroc died in 1813, disemboweled by a cannonball at Bautzen. Napoleon held his hand as he died. The marshals who survived found themselves in a world that no longer had a place for them. Some served the re-restored Bourbon monarchy. Some retired to their estates. Some were exiled. All of them lived with the knowledge that their greatest years, their moments of glory and purpose, were behind them. War had made them legends. Peace made them obsolete. The Congress of Vienna, redrawing Europe again. While Napoleon rotted on St. Helena, Europe's leaders gathered in Vienna to undo everything he had created. The Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815, was one of the most consequential diplomatic gatherings in history. Austria's Prince Metternich, Britain's Lord Castlereagh, Russia's Tsar Alexander, Prussia's King Frederick William III, France's Talleyrand, the master, diplomat who had served every French government from the Revolution through Napoleon and now represented the restored Bourbon monarchy. They sat in gilded rooms and redrew the map of Europe. Their goal was simple: restore the old order, erase Napoleon's changes, bring back the kings, the dynasties, the empires, create a balance of power so no single nation could dominate the continent again. Poland was divided again, most of it absorbed into Russia. The German states were reorganized into a loose confederation dominated by Austria and Prussia. Italy was returned to Austrian control. The Netherlands was united with Belgium. Switzerland was made neutral. And France? France was reduced to its pre-revolutionary borders. No reparations, no occupation, just a restored Bourbon king and a quiet understanding. Never again. The Congress succeeded in creating a balance of power that would last, more or less, for 100 years. But it also buried something that could not be buried: nationalism. Napoleon had awakened it in Italy, where people began to dream of a unified nation instead of a patchwork of kingdoms. In Germany, where the old Holy Roman Empire was gone and something new was stirring. In Poland, which had been erased from the map but not from memory. In Spain, where resistance to foreign occupation had become a source of national pride, the kings could redraw borders, they could restore thrones, but they could not erase what people had learned during the Napoleonic Wars: that nations, not dynasties, were the future. Napoleon's reforms, the empire that survived. Napoleon lost the war, but much of what he built survived. The Code Napoleon, the civil law code he established in 1804, became the foundation of legal systems across Europe and Latin America. It established equality before the law, property rights, secular authority over the church, and the abolition of feudal privileges. It was radical. Before Napoleon, law was a tangled mess of royal decrees, religious edicts, and local customs. After Napoleon, law was codified, rational, universal. To this day, the legal systems of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and dozens of other countries are based on the Code Napoleon. He also reformed education, creating the lycée system, state-run secondary schools designed to train a new generation of administrators, engineers, and military officers. Meritocracy, not birth-determined advancement. He centralized government, creating the préfet system, appointed officials generals who governed France's departments directly, answering to Paris. It made France one of the most efficiently governed states in Europe. He modernized infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals. He standardized weights and measures. He reformed the tax system. He established the Banque de France. He did all of this while fighting wars on multiple fronts. Some historians call him a dictator. He was, but he was also an administrator of genius, a reformer who dragged France and much of Europe into the modern age, and he did it with ruthless efficiency. The myth takes root by the 1830s. Napoleon was no longer just a historical figure. He was a myth. In France, veterans of the Grande Armée gathered in cafes and told stories of glory. They polished their medals. They sang old songs. They remembered when France had been the greatest power on earth, when emperors and kings had trembled at the name Napoleon. Younger generation, who had not lived through the wars, who had not seen the bodies or the mud or the frozen corpses, heard those stories and felt a longing for something they had never known. Greatness. Napoleon became a symbol of French pride, of ambition, of the idea that one man, through sheer will and genius, could change the world. Writers romanticized him. Victor Hugo wrote poems about him. Stendhal idolized him. Balzac praised him. Artists painted him crossing the Alps on a white horse. Dramatic, heroic, larger than life. The reality had been different. Napoleon had crossed the Alps on a mule in terrible weather, struggling through narrow mountain passes. But the myth was better, and myths endure longer than facts. By 1840, when Napoleon's remains were returned to France, hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets of Paris to watch his funeral procession. They wept, they cheered. They mourned a man most of them had never met. His nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, capitalized on this nostalgia. In 1848, he was elected president of France. In 1852, he staged a coup and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. The empire was reborn. Briefly, the military legacy, Napoleon's influence on warfare, cannot be overstated. Before Napoleon, armies moved slowly in rigid formations, fighting set-piece battles decided by discipline and firepower. After Napoleon, armies moved fast in flexible corps, fighting campaigns decided by maneuver, speed, and concentration of force. He proved that mobility was more valuable than numbers, that morale was more important than drill, that a smaller, faster, better-led army could defeat a larger, slower, conventional one. His campaigns are still studied in military academies around the world. West Point, Sandhurst, St. Cyr. The lessons are the same: interior lines. Position yourself between enemy forces so you can defeat them separately before they unite. Maneuver sur le derrière. Move around the enemy's flank or rear, forcing them to fight on your terms. Economy of force. Use the minimum necessary force to achieve an objective, freeing up resources for the decisive point. The decisive point. Identify the critical place and moment in battle, then concentrate overwhelming force there. Napoleon didn't invent these concepts, but he perfected them. He turned warfare into a science, cold, calculated, brutal. Generals for the next century tried to emulate him. Some succeeded, most failed, because Napoleon's genius was not just in his strategy, it was in his ability to inspire, to lead, to make men believe that impossible things were possible, and that cannot be taught. The question that remains, was Napoleon a hero or a tyrant? A liberator or a conqueror? A genius or a madman? The answer depends on who you ask. In France, he is still revered. His tomb in Les Invalides is one of the most visited sites in Paris. School children learn about his victories. His reforms are celebrated. His ambition is admired. In Russia, he is remembered as an invader, the man who burned Moscow, the man who left 500,000 corpses in the snow. In Britain, he is remembered as the enemy, the tyrant who threatened freedom, the dictator who plunged Europe into decades of war. In Germany, Italy, Spain, the memory is mixed. Some see him as a liberator who broke the old feudal systems. Others see him as an oppressor who replaced one form of tyranny with another. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Napoleon was a product of his time, a time of revolution, upheaval, and possibility. He rose because the old order was collapsing and someone needed to fill the void. He conquered because Europe would not accept French dominance peacefully. He fell because ambition, unchecked, always leads to overreach. But he changed the world. Borders were redrawn. Laws were reformed. Nations were born. The idea that a man could rise from nothing and become everything, that talent and will mattered more than birth and blood, that idea spread, and it never went away. May 5th, 1821, St. Helena, 4:49 p.m., Napoleon's last day. He lay in bed, weak, delirious, stomach ravaged by cancer. His loyal followers gathered around him. Bertrand held his hand. Montholon sat by the window. A British doctor monitored his pulse. Outside, the wind howled. Rain lashed the windows. The island was as cold and desolate as it had always been. Napoleon's breathing slowed. He muttered phrases in French. Fragments of memory, battles, names, orders. Tête d'armée, head of the army. He had been many things. Emperor, general, reformer, tyrant, legend. But in the end, he died alone, thousands of miles from home, in a house that leaked when it rained. At 5:49 p.m., Napoleon Bonaparte took his last breath. The man who had tried to redraw Europe was gone, but his shadow would linger for centuries. Final reflection: history is not kind to ambition. It remembers the victories, Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland. It remembers the genius, the flanking maneuvers, the interior lines, the gambles that paid off. But it also remembers the bodies, the frozen soldiers in Russia, the drowned men at the Berezina, the boys of 18 sent to die in Spain and Germany, in the endless wars that consumed a generation. Napoleon believed he could reshape the world through will alone. He believed that genius and ambition were enough. He was almost right. He conquered empires. He crowned kings. He rewrote laws. He redrew maps, but he could not conquer winter. He could not defeat nationalism. He could not outrun his own hubris. In the end, the world reshaped him. And maybe that is the lesson, that empires built on one man's will are empires built on sand. That conquest does not last. That glory fades. But ideas, laws, the belief that talent matters more than birth, those things endure. Napoleon lost the war, but in a way he won the future. The battlefield at Waterloo is still there. You can walk it today. The ridges where Wellington stood, the fields where the Imperial Guard advanced, the farmhouse at La Haye-Sainte, still pockmarked with bullet holes. Tourists come from around the world. They stand in silence, imagining the sound of cannons, the screams of horses, the clash of steel, and if you listen closely, if you close your eyes and let the wind carry the echoes of the past, you can almost hear them. The drums, the commands, the march of soldiers who believed they were invincible until they weren't. History remembers the victors, but the ground remembers everyone. Audience reflection. If you had been one of Napoleon's marshals, if you had followed him from Italy to Egypt, from Austerlitz to Moscow, from glory to exile, would you have stayed loyal at Waterloo, or would you have walked away knowing the empire was already lost? In war, is genius enough to justify the cost? Or is there a point where ambition becomes not strategy, but madness?